Chuck is a senior scholar at the Institute of Policy Studies. And if you don't get his weekly email, you might want to sign up for it. It's really a comprehensive view of what's going on every week in the country. I was really pleased to read the book. It was fun on the level that he did a little tour of social justice actions that have happened in this country in the last 50 years. And he tied that in with his novel, which really made it personal and well, also I knew two of the characters, or one of the characters, Hillary Goodridge, because his lead character in the book went to their wedding, which I know they had. What did they have? They had people on rooftops ready to shoot people if they got out of line, because it was so controversial. Chuck, are you ready to take it from there?
Sure. Great to see a bunch of you, and hooray for the UUs for Just Economic Community, both the presence at GA and ongoing work, and good to see Sally and Jane and people I've seen in person. So thanks for inviting me to be part of the annual meeting. And what I thought I'd do is just talk a little bit about the ideas behind this novel. And so, as Terry said, I've had a long connection, lifelong UU, grew up going to Emerson Unitarian Church in Troy, Michigan, and have stayed connected. I'm now talking to you from the brave little state of Vermont, where we've had a lot of rain. We're actually looking at another 1.5 inches of rain tomorrow. We're in a good place. We're sort of at the top of a watershed, and our soil is in really good shape in terms of absorbing the farm's ability to absorb water. But a lot of our neighbors are reeling, not just from the smoke, but from the deluge. So let me just say a little bit about the Altar to an Erupting Sun, which is I can see a picture here. It's the book that I did, and I hope you'll read it. And a lot of people I know who said, I'm really interested in your past books about inequality, and I know I've talked to UUs for Just Economic Community about the Wealth Hoarders book about sort of the hidden wealth industry. But a lot of my friends said, but I would never have taken your book on vacation. I would never have thought of it as a summer read that would be engaging and interesting. So there's a reason to think about fiction in the same way Adam McKay, made the film Don't Look Up as sort of a popular way to kind of engage people around certain ideas. So my hope in writing this story was to, as Terry said, get people interested in some of the history of social movements, but mostly to sort of look at how do we face this moment we're in from a sort of political and ecological point of view, and to look at one community's preparing for a disrupted future. And what does that look like? And so, and the other obvious goal was to just tell a compelling and good story with good characters that might inspire people to think, in a kind of a future fiction way, in the tradition of like Ursula Le Guin or people who write not zombie apocalypse image fiction, but how is it that humanity can sort of get its act together and turn the corner? And some of you may have seen a science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, wrote an interesting book called Ministry for the Future, which I highly recommend. But it looks out 40 years, and my novel looks out 7 to 10 years. And that's because obviously we don't have 40 years to sort of get our act together and start to shift the trajectory. So basically, Altar to an Erupting Sun has a lead protagonist, a woman named Ray Kelleher. She comes from Southern Ohio. She in 1973 drops out of college. And it's not a spoiler alert to say that the book starts with a rather shocking, provocative action, which is Ray Kelleher now almost 70 years old, learns that she does not have long to live. She's facing down a terminal illness. She only has a few months to live. And she's a death doula. She thinks about, conscious dying and things like that. But in her case, she decides to go out taking her own life and the life of the CEO of a fossil fuel company, who she personally blames for delaying our society's response to climate change. And so that's sort of the initial book. Then it looks ahead 7 years to say, well, what impact did her action have on her community, on the society? And so that's the future fiction element of it, which is to look at the blowback, the negative blowback from her action, the repression, the criminalization of dissent. But there's also some interesting openings that happen related to society focusing on the role of the fossil fuel industry as an actor and as a kind of rogue industry that has captured our political system, funding denial, funding opposition to alternatives, and really running out the clock in terms of humanity's ability to have a real healthy response to the ecological, particularly climate change. So, and then the book goes back to sort of ask what shaped Ray Kelleher. What were the forces, the movements that formed her? And she is, a lively character. She's the life of the party. She's the person who, if she came to the UUJEC annual meeting, might be, wearing a silly hat or kind of keeping, she's the person who would remember your birthday and organize a party. And she's just a lively, full of life character who kind of weaves people together and, forms a back to the land community later in her life and gets people, back together in southern Vermont. So anyway, that's just a little bit of the context, but one of the parts of the book that I hope will be interesting to people is, what does a community-based response look like to climate change and disrupted future? So we know that there's this larger struggle around how do we reduce emissions at the global level? How do we make sure that we don't shoot past 1.5 degrees centigrade, certainly past 3 degrees centigrade, which we're currently on track to do, which would lead to essentially sort of catastrophic events. And of course, none of us know what the future holds. We don't know what Gaia holds. We would have thought 10 years ago we would have been facing some of the things we're seeing today, but turns out the ocean has played this remarkable role as a carbon sink, drawing down some of the carbon. Well, now we're maybe coming to the end of that, but we don't really honestly understand Mother Earth and Gaia and all of the properties. But we know that if we stay on the current trajectory of dumping, trillions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere, we're essentially heading toward a catastrophic future. And another book recommendation, my friend Andrew Boyd wrote a book called I Want a Better Catastrophe, which is acknowledging that we're sort of heading into a disrupted future. At this point, our human efforts, our organizing efforts, our campaign efforts still can make a difference between a really bad catastrophe and a better catastrophe. And he even has a little humorous chant. Maybe we can do it at the end of the meeting, but it's basically, what do we want? A better catastrophe. When do we want it? As late in the century as possible. But part of it is to look at where we have agency, where we can make a difference. And so where you live, wherever we are, I draw on, the innovations in local food systems, relocalizing the economy, mutual aid, practicing welcoming strangers and immigrants, which is going to be part of a disrupted future. People are going to have to move from one place to another. You may have to move to my community, or I may have to move to your community. How are we going to as a society and as communities respond to that. But there's also the aspect of celebration and culture. How do we reroute the things that make us human in place instead of looking at, you know, global telecommunications and social media for our culture? How do we relocalize culture and media and access to land? And how do we deal with the fact that we have this racial divide and people have been excluded from access to land, and some of them may need to move to wherever we are? So one of the fun parts of the book is to show what does that, in the next 7 years, how do some of those activities that we see glimmers of, how do those play out in a positive way to help humanity turn the corner? And one of the things that may be of interest to some of you is the part of the culture shift that has to do with death and conscious dying, and thinking about sort of the last chapters of each of our lives. And again, Ray Kelleher, my main character, is kind of a pioneer in thinking about green burials and ecological and end of life practices, and celebrating while people are alive, celebrating their lives, and all kinds of aspects of what it looks like to die wise in the Anthropocene. So that's a component of the book. But let me just talk about two other things that I think might be of interest to our UUs for Just Economic Community. One is around what I call altar building, and the other is around the conversation about violence and nonviolence and the inevitable escalation of tactics that we're going to see. And just to say, the book is an altar. It is an altar to real living people. My hope is that people will read some of the stories about Vietnam veteran Brian Wilson, or Juanita Nelson, war tax resistor and civil rights leader, and other characters that sort of weave into the story and show us, model bold responses to the political moment that we're in. And Ray Kelleher is an altar builder, and most of you are familiar with sort of Day of the Dead and the idea that you create a remembrance altar for those that you love. But what Ray explores is actually those traditions come from most cultures in the world. Have in Vietnam, she learns about the altar building traditions there. I come from an Irish Celtic tradition. There's the Samhain and the sort of what we think of around Halloween as the thin time when you can go back and forth between the present and the other side, if you will. And so Ray becomes a builder of altars, of community and private altars, where people can honor ancestors, and in this case also honor the movements that shaped the life that we're living now. The women's movement, the anti-war movements, the movement against U.S. intervention in Central America, the movement to prevent nuclear power plants from being built, and the movements around climate change. All of these are part of the story and are woven in. But let me just say something about Ray and her unthinkable action. And Ray is somebody who is steeped in nonviolence. It's not a flippant thing that she has decided to go out with this sort of shocking action. She is schooled in all the sort of nonviolent traditions. She knows about Norman Morrison and the Vietnamese monks who self-immolated themselves in opposition to the Vietnam War. She knows about people who have used their bodies to block construction of new pipeline infrastructure and have risked jail for that. She's aware of traditions of fasting and moral suasion. So and part of the book explores all that, because it's her belief that we are now in what she would call a sort of Dietrich Bonhoeffer moment in the fight to save the earth. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the German theologian and a pacifist who then, during World War II, decided to join a plot to try to assassinate Hitler. It was a failed plot, obviously, but then he was captured and imprisoned and executed for this witness. So here's somebody who's steeped in pacifism and affirmation of life and the abhorration of murder, but who makes that shocking decision. And Ray feels that for a number of reasons, the fossil fuel industry and her, as she grows older, I should say, she starts off with a perspective probably in the 90s as she starts to learn about climate change and the amount of carbon and methane emissions going into the atmosphere. She thinks, well, we're all responsible, particularly those of us in the United States who are middle class, affluent, the northern countries. We are the disproportionate burners of carbon and methane. We're the ones whose lifestyles are, driving the climate disruption, and we have a disproportionate responsibility. But then she starts to learn in the final 5 years of her life, which correspond to the last 5 years of our lives, about the role that ExxonMobil and Shell knew over 40 years ago about the harms of burning, the level of carbon emissions, and have learned about the role that they've played in funding right-wing movements to capture our political system and to ensure that there would be no alternative energy policies, and how a couple dozen global corporations and their leaders have used their considerable power to block alternatives. The reason you can't take a high-speed rail from your part of the world to another part of the US is because the fossil fuel industry worked and lobbied against some of the transit infrastructure that we so badly need, lobbied against vehicle emission standards, lobbied against community-based efforts to expand solar and other alternative energies. And so the more she learns, the more she understands the power that this industry is exercised. And in fact, when we sit here and we talk about, each of our own individual carbon footprint and what we can do about that, Ray Kelleher would say, well, that's important, but it's also a distraction, because the drivers that really brought us to this moment are these a couple hundred, leaders of corporations and their financial enablers. So she starts to believe that these folks are the incarnation of evil, that they are incapable of stopping themselves from pushing new fossil fuel infrastructure. And here we are. Since I wrote this novel, Congress had this whole debate about how do we deal with deficit reduction and the debt ceiling. And, the Republicans and Democrats had, all this stage drama about this. But what happened? They cut a deal, and in that deal, they authorized the construction of yet another fossil fuel pipeline project at a time when we should be building no new fossil fuel infrastructure. So these corporations, as we sit here, are using their power to run out the clock. And that was really what drove Ray to want to engage and act in this way. And I would say what we're going to see, as the waters rise here in Vermont, or the smoke comes into your community, or there will be droughts or other disruptions, our food system will be disrupted. We're going to start to see more and more, extreme heat. All these things we've known for 20 years that this was what we would get. And yet we've been unable to respond as a society. And again, the fossil fuel industry is happy to have each of us say, oh, well, we're all responsible. And geez, maybe I should have biked to the store instead of driving. And geez, I'm responsible. And again, there is an element of responsibility. But as my friend Patrick Rainsborough says, 2% ordinary people, 98% fossil fuel industry responsible for the moment that we're in. And that really does should change our tactics. We should be looking at ways to, like, how do we weaken the fossil fuel sector? Shouldn't we be doing hearings and congressional hearings on how they've used their power to block changes? And actually, Sheldon Whitehouse, a senator from Rhode Island, just did a hearing on the fossil fuel industry funneling dark money to political organizations working to support, block, and attack climate change movements, attack wokeness movements, movements around Black Lives Matter. And they're using their dark money, back channeling money, to sow dissent and keep us divided and keep the climate change issue kind of in the culture war space where there's still people saying it's a hoax. That is the fact that we're in that moment is not just because we're politically polarized as a society, but that they're they're pouring gasoline literally on the existing divisions that exist in our society. And that's part of what's keeping us divided. So, and you hear this conversation, like maybe there's something wrong with our species. Like maybe we can't really think. We can respond to immediate emergencies. We can respond to an emergency among people in our immediate circles, but maybe we are just wired wrong and unable to think about responding to long-term or intermediate term emergencies, or to something that's happening in Bangladesh or in the global south, where, well, I think that's wrong. I think we actually are wired to be in solidarity with one another, that is our nature. And we are wired to say, oh, if my behavior is causing harm, I want to alter my behavior, not just for myself, but in solidarity with others. But again, the fossil fuel industry is hell-bent on saying, well, we're all selfish. And this is because you're selfish, and you won't give up your, your heated, whatever, hot baths, you're taking too many hot baths. That's a strategy that the fossil fuel industry now is deploying to distract and deflect us once again and divide us. So here's Ray Kelleher, and to be honest, I'm not advocating for people to go out and commit political assassination. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's morally wrong, tactically wrong. But I think it's an interesting thing to say, well, what would it look like? What does bold action for each of us look like in this moment? And so this is a sort of serious conversation that is woven into a book that also has hopefully humor and stories and other elements to it. But since I know who you are, I knew you could dive into the the more controversial and edgy parts of this conversation. So that's, I'm eager to have a conversation and hear thoughts. Those of you who maybe had a chance to read the book, welcome any reflections. I'm hoping that, and actually one just little bit of hopeful information is people are reading the book, and I'm getting every day dozens of emails from people reading the book saying, this is really interesting. This is really compelling. And it's making me think about, how do we take on the fossil fuel industry? And how do we treat them like a drug cartel and withdraw social power? How do we divest our investments from the fossil fuel industry? Some of you may be familiar with Third Act, which is the group that Bill McKibben and Akaya Winwood started to organize people over 60 to step forward on the climate change issue. The premise being, why should we assume that young people are going to lead this movement when in fact some of our older folks have more stability? We're not at the beginning of our lives. We can bear witness. We have experience and skills that come from lifelong activism. We have some financial stability in some cases. Maybe we should be the ones stepping up and taking risks. So Third Act is one of the a national movement of seniors, and they're zeroing in on the financial enablers, the credit card, the Chase Bank and JP Morgan, and the companies that are the big investors in the fossil fuel industry, and saying, let's move our money out of that. And while we're doing that, let's question their social license. let's question their legitimacy. What would it look like to create public authorities to buy up the assets of these fossil fuel companies and ensure that they never burn their assets? What would it look like to treat the politicians that accept their money in the same way you would treat a politician who accepted money from drug cartels? How do you delegitimate the big money that's flowing from oil, gas, and coal into our political system? So that's maybe my offering for the beginning of a conversation. And I don't know if Terry, you want to use, or if you're in a position to see people and facilitate, or I can also
Yep.
try. Okay,
I
great.
can do that.
So,
Dick, you
thank you
need
for
to
listening.
unmute.
Me say something? Yeah, Chuck,
Hi, Dick.
here you're talking about the oil companies and whatnot. I actually think it's even bigger than that. I think it's the entire economic and financial systems. What people sometimes call neoliberalization, which puts first short-term profits against, I mean, that's their number one value. And anything longer term becomes subordinate. I think it's the kind of system that corrupts even good people because they are incentivized to exploit the earth, exploit wherever they can to maximize short-term profits. So to me, we have to look at actually what are we going to do, not just to blame the fossil fuel companies, but what will we do to change the whole system? And that's even far bigger, especially the financial system, how it runs the world, you know, for the 1% in every country now. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I obviously agree with you that this is part of a larger system, that it's part of the short-termism and extractive nature of the current form of capitalism we're living in. And I think it's important to see that the energy sector, the carbon energy sector, and the financial enablers are really the drivers. So yes, there's a larger, but where are the pressure points in that larger system? And where in the next 7 years is there a segment? So I would make the case that we really want to laser focus in on this particular powerful industry and take them down several notches, or essentially socialize some of the assets of the fossil fuel sector. If you look at the history of the oil industry in our political system, starting in the 1930s, the oil industry is one of the biggest funders of right-wing politics. The oil billionaires funded John Birch. Now we know about the Koch brothers and how they've used their industry, their extractive industry resources to fund, essentially bankroll the radical right in our society and fund the polarization. So, whatever your action handle is for fixing the larger system, I'm not dissuading you, but I'm making the case that a couple of dozen powerful corporations who have reaped record profits are excellent targets right now. Because here's what I think is going to happen. We're going to keep experiencing climate disruptions. In the Kim Stanley Robinson book, Ministry for the Future, the wake-up call is a horrific heat wave in India that kills millions of people. And that becomes the galvanizing event to get Earthlings to sort of finally take a serious look at the drivers of climate change. But even in his story, the US is the last, because how our political system has been captured by that industry. So, I think there are some really good pressure points, and people's awareness is only going to grow. There's always going to be, this 30% of the population that's just, it's a hoax, magical thinking, we're anti-science, but there's this huge segment of immobilized people that once they realize that heat wave that we're going through this summer, those wildfires and smoke, these floods have all been supercharged by climate change, driven by a reckless industry. I think that will create a political opening that will only exist. So that collision course is an opportunity to help change our direction.
Yeah, I guess my concern is that you're right. It's a political opening, but really, when I see it, the reason fossil fuel industry has become so powerful and it was able to get away with all this is that fossil fuels, especially oil, have been what has been driving economic growth globally and nationally. And so you'll have people coming along saying, well, yeah, I'd like to go along with you, but let's go lower our standard of living. Well, that's true. As far as I can tell, we're going to have to learn to live with less. And I think people need to realize that. Otherwise, the fossil fuel industry will always be able to come back and say, well, you want to give up your extra car or your fancy house or something like that. People are going to need to realize that we have to make some sacrifices.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, part of what I tried to do fictionally was show what does it look like for a community to live with less, but actually improve the quality of our lives. You know, relocalizing the economy, food, celebration, culture, mutual aid, all those things I think are part of the picture. And I think you and I agreed to energy, the sort of cheap, easy to get access to fossil fuels is kind of what's driven our almost a century of our growth and our assumptions about what our life should look like. And we totally have to recalibrate that. But it's, you know, I think the energy sector is a driving force where we should focus on in terms of intervention. I see Ariel has
Okay.
had her hand up. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, she's
Hi.
been very patient.
Well, anything I'm thinking is relating to everything that you're all saying, and I haven't read the book yet, but I'm really eager to. You know, assumptions are the thing that I was thinking about too, that I just feel like are so much actually shaped by propaganda, but then they become what most people across the political spectrum consider to be just working ordinary knowledge. And I'm old enough to remember, and it's a grave concern. Just a couple of examples of the assumption that somehow capitalism in any form is the quote unquote best economic system. Where did that come from? And why is it not questioned? And I mean, I'm hearing that assumption, for example, embedded even in NPR when they consider themselves to be reporting news. An associated one is this idea that public companies that sell shares of stock, that somehow their number one priority, the reason they exist, is to make short-term profits. That's an idea that somebody from business school floated about 20 years ago. It didn't really exist before that. And suddenly, again, it's an embedded assumption in reporting that I don't consider liberal reporting anymore, but it's kind of better to have in the background when I'm doing stuff than a television, which I haven't owned. This is really, really, really disturbing. I think how much our ideals and our imaginations are constrained by assumptions. Just one more I'll think about. Nobody actually talks about sustainable economy anymore. Growth is assumed. Whatever happened to the conversations about small is beautiful? I don't actually think most people would have to give up much of anything if we could undo the concentrations of wealth that greed and its enablers have enabled. I think there'd be plenty for everyone. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I one of the reasons it was fun to venture into fiction is to imagine what would the quality of life be like if you know, I think I agree with both things you said, that there's both, we have to, and what Dick was saying, we have to kind of power down. We have to have a life that is considerably less energy use, you know, and part of that is, you know, maybe we're not, you know, the aviation sector. Well, we can try to decarbonize the aviation sector, but we could also, you know, that's not necessarily the biggest consumer of driver of greenhouse gases. I look forward to Terry talking about the agricultural sector and how do we shift to a regenerative agriculture system that also, but I think the combination of the assumptions about growth that you're talking about, Ariel, that we're just going to have unlimited growth, but also life living within Earth's boundaries is not so bad. It may be that we're more place-based and more, it means that our families hopefully will not be as spread across 5 time zones, and we will not have to be depending on the burning of oil to stay connected with one another. So those are some of the possibilities. And one thing I think some of you all appreciate is, since it was a work of fiction and I got to write it, there are hardly any cell phones in this book. There's hardly any social media or techno fixes. There's not this sort of like, oh, we're just going to technologically work our way out of it. Actually, the forms of technology are things that have existed through wisdom traditions and societies for millennium. How do we live together? How do we live in harmony with the earth? How do we celebrate and create lively culture and carnival together? All those things are part of how humans existed long before fossil fuel, long before extractive capitalism, and are part of the path back to, so it's not some techno fix, or if you broadly think about technology, these are more simple technologies that we already know, including how do we get along with one another. There's some technological traditions that we could draw from there. So.
Okay, Kathleen has raised her hand without raising it. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Oh, good. And my mute's off. So thank you, Chuck, and thank you for whoever sent out the email address message, because I really wanted to know more about this book, and it's right in line with a number of other books I'm reading, and I just picked up the one that you mentioned that's about 30 or 40 years in the future. I'm reading one part of a Dandelion Revolution by Sun Riviera, and she envisions the future it's more of a social construct of what we need to, emphasizing how we need to support each other and making the right moves. But I also want to support what Ariel said, and also the participation, both that Lucy and I did in Salem, Oregon, against Chase Bank. If you remember, one of the reasons apartheid ended was because the students across the United States basically said, we need to end investment. Our universities cannot support apartheid. And they started the movement for divestment. And Vanguard holds the majority of money that's going into, it's when you look at who's invested in the big oil and big energy sector, Vanguard's in the top 3. So Quaker Earth Care Witness is trying to put pressure on Vanguard to put pressure on the big energy sector players. And I did text that so far since mid-May, they've had 17 million divested from Vanguard, basically saying, we're the start, but this is what we're going to continue to do until you start putting pressure and not funding big oil and that industry. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that the divestment movement, the South Africa model, and then now the fossil fuel divestment movement, there are trillions of dollars of religious denominations, institutions, individuals, philanthropy that have pledged to take their money out of fossil fuel and move it into sort of the new equitable economy, the clean energy and community-based development. And that's great. And it's not about it's a public action where you toot the horn and announce because part of what's going on there is you're saying the fossil fuel industry does not have legitimacy. It is a harmful industry. We should withdraw our the social license should be revoked for these corporations to exist and operate. That's partly the message of the divestment movement. So I think that's a very positive, encouraging thing. There's a similar movement around insurance. Who insures these fossil fuel infrastructure projects? Who are the professionals, the creative artists who design the advertising campaigns about how ExxonMobil is all loves you and all this, you know? Like there's within each of these sectors, there's a withdrawal of support. There are huge cracks emerging, which I take heart in.
Okay, I had a couple of comments. One was just to back up your idea of the personal carbon footprint that was developed by BP. And I think that tells us we should be very suspicious of it. And the one thing when I was reading the book that kept occurring to me was a metaphor from a movie I really liked, Rosalie Goes Shopping. And Rosalie figures out how to con a bank out of $10 million. And her comment is, well, if you owe the bank $10,000, that's your problem. But if you owe them 10 million, it's their problem. And I think what we're seeing is that these people are killing all these other people. The fossil fuel companies are literally murdering people to make money. Because, well, and I mean they've done it when anyone gets in the way of oil exploration. They literally murder people, but their pollution is going to kill a lot of people. And then Mark had a question: have you sold your movie rights yet?
The movie rights are still available.
Okay,
There is an
I
audiobook.
don't need them, but
No. But there is an audiobook that's going to be coming out in a couple weeks, narrated by a terrific actress named Kamala May. So she's for people who prefer to take their books in audio form, that'll be useful.
and Lucy has her hand up. She needs some mute.
Sally was first.
Oh, I didn't see Sally.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, divestment is an important thing. Green Faith has a climate finance circle that's working on religious divestments on various nominations. We also, on the flip side, have all the repression of the boycott, divest, and sanction movement against Israel related to the Palestinian occupation. When I talk about murdering in the terms of fossil fuel industry, I think of Stephen Donziger, who actually won a victory against fossil fuel and then was subject to house arrest for years and finally got out after the actual fossil fuel companies prosecuted him. And finally, we had a divestment and reparations resolution at GA this year, which got a lot of attention, didn't quite make it, but climate finance folks said, you know, anything over 18% is a victory, and we had 30. So any thoughts on that, Jack?
No, I agree. I would keep putting those resolutions forward. And I think there is a right-wing anti-sanctions movement. It's actually partially funded by the Israeli government, getting certain states to pay, there's a great documentary called Boycott that sort of tells the story of these states that are pushing to make this illegal, but and that's somewhat of the backlash against environmental social governance standards and the whole idea that corporations have some sort of social responsibility. The reason that is a contested social issue is largely because the energy industry and the Israeli government have gotten into funding a counter to put a pushback. And then you have the Rick DeSantis's of the world, running for office on that. So it's touching a nerve. It's getting to this. It's hitting close to home when governments, when there's debates about whether we should be allowed to have boycotts, which is a ridiculous proposition. So yeah, I think that Sally, I really think that's, and I think we are going to see an escalation of tactics. We already are. In Europe, you're seeing this more militant action, not just people throwing soup at works of art or kind of extinction rebellion, blocking sporting events. There's going to be a lot of disruption. There's a new group called Climate Defiance, which are young folks who basically are interrupting any politician who has failed to take leadership on climate change issues. And another sort of cultural resource is a dramatic film called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is based on a nonfiction book, but How to Blow Up a Pipeline it's really worth watching as a understand. We're going to be living through this, and we're going to see the repression that comes from that. Stephen Danziger house arrest is just one example, but we're going to live through a criminalization of legitimate dissent driven by the fossil fuel industry and their desire to protect their infrastructure. So that's why I think this conversation is relevant. And we need to be able to explain to people, well, the reason there's this escalation is because our political system is incapable of responding to the crisis. It's been captured by the fossil fuel industry,
Right,
and by
that's
big
right.
money.
Hey, Lucy.
Yeah, first, Chuck, thank you so much for your book. It was like a historical novel for me from the 70s on, of movement actions, and just so good to go through all of that again. One of the people you mentioned was Reverend Terry Burke in Jamaica Plain. So good to hear his name. I was in his church in the late 80s, and my question for you, and I'll say some more about what he did, is how can we get Unitarian Universalists to care enough, to be mobilized enough, to create communities that move us in that direction? And to use Terry as an example, I met Chris Hedges at his congregation, for example. So he brought in radical people to speak to us. Another thing was that we shared doing a Bible study during the Nicaragua whole situation where we were all going down there to visit. And the Bible study was on the way the gospel speaks to change, particularly in economic justice, but community, bringing people together around a message that motivates them, which often you use lack because we run away from the Bible often. Unfortunately, there are good parts to it that we could be using, or other ways to inspire people. And in that group was someone who was a welfare mom who gave that perspective in the Bible study group that was mostly more affluent Unitarian Universalists. So I'm just interested in any ways thinking of our faith and our congregations and individuals. How can we move people to more action? I live near a church where climate doesn't even come up. We could be a movement ourselves, and any comments you have on that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Lucy. And I was just doing a book conversation at First Church Wednesday night in Jamaica Plain. And I was happy to be able to get, to have Terry be a character. So Ray Kelleher, the lead character in my book, and her partner Reggie literally join First Church. They meet Terry Burke. He shows them the Emily Green Balch window in the sanctuary. Emily Green Balch, of course, won the Nobel Peace Prize, who was a member of the church. He sort of connects to that tradition and history book. So I was happy to be able to lift that up. And Terry's went to graduate school with Chris Hedges, and Chris Hedges loved Terry. He would do anything Terry wanted, so he came back several times to do talks at First Church. But I think the I think the reason I love being with you all, even though I understand we're small and we is that the UUs as a sort of undercurrent and formation and a presence in many, many communities can be the place where these kind of conversations can happen that aren't happening in other places. And like you say, Lucy, the climate conversation isn't even happening in a lot of places. Well, I kind of think the objective reality of the coming years will change that. There will be people who will be much more open to that conversation and to be able to open the doors and invite people in and, you know, have a discussion group and show films and documentaries and have speakers, and all those things really will matter. UUs interested in ideas, interested in books, interested in community can play a very important role in convening people and helping us face the future, doing mutual aid work, and where you know, groups like Third Act, where let's say we're an aging subsection of the UUs, let's form a sort of Third Act tradition where we think about what's the role of people over a certain age with a certain amount of agency. So many people lack any sense of agency, and that is one of the good things about a lot of our UU congregations, is not lacking for agency, and that's what's necessary. So I would celebrate what we already have, and then just keep reaching out and keep inviting people into the conversations, and more people are going to be looking for answers, and there's going to be a lot of people peddling the wrong answers. so all the more reason to be a community center for critical thinking.
Thank you.
Okay, Meg and Hillary have been patiently waiting. Can you go ahead?
Yes, am I unmuted?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Hillary's the expert on this, I'm not. I wanted to say that I have two resources. One of them, I don't know if any of you have ever seen. This was made by people who actually were in the Weather Underground, and it was presented in Santa Fe when I was there years ago. And it has to do with what your main character does. A decision was made at some point that it was wise to actually kill people, because that would bring attention to something and that would change people's awareness in this country. That this film has the people who came out from the underground talking about the mistake they made in that, and that they came to that belief, which they have realized was really not all right at all, and turned themselves in. And there are interviews with all of those people in this. So I just think it's another resource to be used. The other one is the new book by Michelle Obama. It's been out for some months. And it is, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but
The light within us.
Yes.
The light we carry within
I'm
us.
so glad your memory is so much better than mine now. The light within us, Hillary's right.
Yeah.
And that book, she has written that book to talk about the uncertainty that the pandemic created in isolation, when people were isolated from one another, and the uncertainty that that's created, which may be part of why UUs and other people are not more activated. And she actually goes through her own steps in feeling numb, and then feeling depressed, and then feeling uncertain about what to do, and reveals herself, and how what she decided to do was find out what resources she had within that she was not touching anymore. And that had been hidden also in her many years as being First Lady, where she had to be so careful all of the time, most of the time. Once in a while, she wasn't careful. And it's a book that has both humor in it. It talks about all kinds of impact that cause people to be uncertain and non-active, and how she recovered her own realization of her power, her internal power. And I think it's an incredibly great resource for helping to activate people, and so well written, so well written. So I just wanted to say those two things, and thank you very much for writing this. I have not read it. I'm going to get it immediately and read it. And thanks so much to all of you. I really appreciate what you're doing in trying to preserve life. Thank you.
You just riffing off the movie about the Weather Underground. You know, I have to say, I hear a certain amount of chatter about, you know, is this a Bonhoeffer moment in the fight to save the Earth? Meaning, and you know, in my book, I drew on people like Mark Rudd, who were part of the Weather Underground, who articulately explained the folly and the foolishness tactically, particularly in a U.S. context. Kathy Ann Power, some of you may know her. She was drove a getaway car and was in an incident in Boston, a bank robbery that was sort of a political bank robbery, and you know, went underground and turned herself in and served. She was sort of my prison consultant, if you will, and an advisor around parts of the story, and also really an eloquent spokesperson around. There's so many other tactics and pressure points that are more effective, but it's still that question of how do we witness? What does a bold witness look like in this moment in relation to these industries? Where can we intervene? And that's where I put up a thing in the chat just about, you know, at the website connected to the book I did. There's a lot of resources like what Hillary and Meg just were talking about, that are to help us have this conversation, this critical conversation.
Thank you.
It looks like we ended this just at the right time, because I said after 2 we'd have to consider breaking it off. But we've had a really lively conversation and interesting, and I learned a lot. If I have one question, it would be, who were the people that guided you to write this? What did they say? What did they contribute?
Well, I have a lot of the elders in the book, some of whom are, you know, on my altar, if you will, that contributed. They're there, and sometimes their real names are in the story. But yeah, I had a lot of help, a lot of readers, because I was writing in the main character was a woman. I got a lot of coaching from my women readers on that, which was fun and really interesting. And I'm not somebody who thinks you can't write from a perspective that isn't yours, but and I should say the other part of that, what I wanted to do was lift up, like a lot of the people I know, you know, in this conversation right now, lift up the people who've devoted their lives to working for racial and economic and environmental justice. You know, I don't know there are that many novels that really depict the lifers, the lifelonger committed people. So it is a celebration of you all. And yeah, I hope you'll read the book. And you know, it's not gonna be, my goal is not to be a bestseller, it's to be a cult classic or something where, you know, and so if you like it, please recommend it to other people. Please give it a rating on Goodreads. If you have Amazon, I asked Terry was lovely. He did a review on Amazon, which actually does make a difference in the world of books. So if you, so there's, you know, if you, but most of all, spread the word by word of mouth. You know, I know so many books I read are because somebody I know told me that it was worth the trouble. So anyway, thank you all, and I'm looking forward to hanging around and also hearing about the Farm Bill work and others. So thanks for having me.
Sure. Okay, well, I have a reading. two readings actually, but one to begin with, and that's Dr. Martin Luther King, in his Nobel Peace Prize address. He said the second evil which plagues the modern world is that of poverty. Like a monstrous octopus, it projects its nagging, prehensile tentacles in lands and villages all over the world. Almost 2/3 of the peoples of the world go to bed hungry at night. They are undernourished, ill-housed, and shabbily clad. Many of them have no houses or beds to sleep in. Their only beds are the sidewalks of the cities and the dusty roads of the villages. Most of these poverty-stricken children of God have never seen a physician or a dentist.